The smell was the first thing to greet her in the morning and the last thing to leave her at night. It was a thick, sour perfume of spilled whiskey, stale beer, and the unwashed bodies of men who spent their days in dust and their nights in regret. It clung to her hair, her clothes, the very pores of her skin. Theda knew the scent of the Golden Spur Saloon better than she knew the memory of her own mother's face. It was the smell of survival. Her knees ached, a dull, deep throb that had become a constant companion. The rough-hewn floorboards were a landscape of splinters and dark stains, each one a testament to a night of revelry she had no part in, save for cleaning its aftermath. With a bucket of murky water and a brush worn down to a nub, she worked her way from the bat-wing doors to the back wall. Her world shrunk to the few feet of wood in front of her. Men's boots, caked with mud and manure, stepped around her, sometimes over her, as if she were just another piece of furniture. She was a ghost in this loud, bright place, a creature of the floor, noticed only when she was in the way. Tonight was no different. The piano player hammered out a tune that was more noise than music, and the laughter from the card tables was sharp and brittle. Theda kept her head down, her focus narrowed to the methodical scrape and splash of her work. Scrape, splash, wipe. The rhythm was a prayer of sorts, a way to keep the despair at bay. She had arrived in the town of redemption with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a secret she guarded like a flickering candle in a high wind. The saloon was the only place that would hire a woman with no name and no references, asking no questions as long as the floors were clean by morning. A chair scraped back violently, followed by a curse and the heavy shatter of glass. Amber liquid and shards sprayed across the section of floor she had just finished. Theda didn't flinch. She simply let out a slow breath, set her brush in the bucket, and reached for her rag. Another stain to scrub, another memory to erase. A pair of fancy boots belonging to Mr. Finch. The land agent with eyes that stripped a person bare, stepped right through the puddle, tracking whiskey across her clean boards. He didn't so much as glance down. She was just about to dip her rag into the mess when a different pair of boots appeared at the edge of her vision. They were not fancy, but they were solid, made of thick leather, scuffed at the toes and dusted with the pale dirt of the high plains. They stopped, waiting. Theda looked up, expecting an order or a complaint, and her eyes met his. He was a quiet man. She'd seen him in town before, but rarely in the saloon. Reno. That was his name. He owned the biggest ranch in the territory, the one that spread across the entire northern valley. He was powerful, everyone knew that, but he wore his power like a well-worn coat, not a shining badge. He had dark hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky, and he looked at her. Truly looked. Not at her worn dress or her chapped hands, but at her face. For a heartbeat she felt like a person again, not just a pair of hands holding a rag. He didn't say anything. He simply bent down, his knees cracking softly, and began picking up the larger shards of glass, placing them carefully on a napkin from a nearby table. The gesture was so unexpected it stole the air from Theda's lungs. No one helped her. No one ever saw her labor. The saloon owner, a portly man named Silas, paid her in coin and indifference. The patrons paid her no mind at all. But here was the most formidable man in the county, kneeling on the dirty floor, helping her clean up a mess he hadn't made. When the glass was cleared, he stood, his shadow falling over her. He looked down at her bucket of filthy water. "You can't clean much with that," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed. It wasn't a criticism, just a statement of fact. Before she could find her own voice to respond, he had lifted the heavy wooden bucket as if it weighed nothing and carried it to the door. He emptied it into the dusty street, then walked to the pump in the alley. She heard the rhythmic squeak and splash as he worked the handle. He returned with a bucket of clean, cold water that sloshed over the rim. He set it down beside her. "That's better," he said. He looked at her one more time, a long, unreadable gaze. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, and then he turned and walked to the bar, leaving Theta kneeling in a small circle of stunned silence. The water in the new bucket was so clear she could see her own reflection, pale and wide-eyed. For the first time in a long time, the work didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a promise. Someone had seen her. Weeks passed. Theta continued her work, but something had shifted inside her. The memory of that small kindness was a secret warmth she carried through the long nights. Reno did not come back to the saloon, and she told herself it was foolish to have thought anything of it. He was a rancher, a man of land and sky, and she was a woman of sawdust and floors. Their worlds were not meant to touch again. Then, one sweltering afternoon, chaos erupted in the street. A horse, spooked by a backfiring wagon, had thrown its rider. The man, one of Reno's ranch hands, lay in the street, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. A bigger worry was the gash on his forearm, a deep, ragged tear from catching on a rusted hitching post as he fell. The town doctor, a man whose hands often shook from drink more than age, was called. He clucked his tongue, poured whiskey over the wound, and stitched it up with clumsy, thick thread. He set the bone as best he could and sent the man to his room at the boarding house with a bottle of laudanum. Theta heard the story in bits and pieces from the gossips at the saloon that night. By the next evening, the news was worse. The hand, a young man named Billy, was burning with fever. The arm was swollen to twice its size, streaked with angry red lines. The doctor had been back, shaken his head, and muttered about blood poisoning. He said there was nothing more to be done. He was giving up. In the Golden Spur, men spoke of Billy in the past tense. Theta felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She had seen a wound like that before, on her father, after a farming accident. She remembered her grandmother, a woman whose hands were never idle, grinding herbs and simmering poultices on the stove. "The earth has its own medicine," she used to say. "You just have to know where to look." Theta had watched, had learned. She knew the feathery leaves of yarrow that could staunch a flow of blood, and the broad, humble leaves of the plantain weed that grew by every roadside, known for its power to draw out poison and cool a fevered wound. She made a decision. It was a risk, a terrible one. A saloon girl playing at doctoring could be run out of town or worse. But the thought of that young man dying from ignorance and infection was a weight she couldn't bear. After her shift, long after midnight, she slipped out the back door of the saloon. The moon was a silver sliver in the sky, offering just enough light. She went to the creek bed behind the town, her eyes scanning the ground. She found it, a healthy patch of plantain, its leaves cool and waxy beneath her fingers. She gathered a handful, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. At the boarding house, the door to Billy's room was ajar. Two of his fellow ranch hands sat inside, their faces grim in the flickering lamplight. They looked up, surprised, as she entered. "What do you want?" one of them asked, his voice thick with suspicion. "I can help him," Theta said, her own voice barely a whisper. She held up the leaves. "This can draw the poison." The man snorted. "He needs a doctor, not weeds from a saloon girl." "The doctor has given up on him," she replied, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "What harm can I do now?" The men exchanged a look. The one who had spoken shrugged, a gesture of defeat. "Do what you want. It's no matter now." Theta moved to the bedside. Billy was barely conscious, muttering nonsense, his skin slick with sweat. She gently unwrapped the bandage. The smell of infection was foul, and the sight of the wound made her stomach clench. It was worse than she'd feared. Ignoring the hostile stares of the men, she went to work. She washed her hands thoroughly, then chewed the plantain leaves into a paste, just as her grandmother had taught her. It was a rustic, unseemly method, but it was the quickest way to release the plant's healing properties. She carefully packed the green poultice into the angry wound, then covered it with a clean strip of cloth torn from her own petticoat. She sat with him for hours, changing the poultice, bathing his face with cool water. The two ranch hands eventually fell asleep in their chairs. Theda didn't notice. Her entire world was focused on the young man's ragged breathing. Just before dawn, as the sky began to lighten from black to gray, the door opened. Reno stood there. He had been riding all night, alerted by a messenger about his man's decline. His face was a mask of exhaustion and worry. He saw her, kneeling by the bed, her dress stained, her face pale. He looked from her to the strange green paste on Billy's arm, and his eyes narrowed. Theda's heart froze. This was it. He would throw her out. He would accuse her of witchcraft. But he didn't speak. He walked to the bed and placed a calloused hand on Billy's forehead. He felt the boy's pulse. He looked at the wound, at the clean cloth, at the determined set of Theda's jaw. He saw not a meddling saloon girl, but a woman engaged in a desperate, gentle battle. He pulled up the one remaining chair and sat. And he watched. They sat in silence as the sun rose, the quiet rancher and the woman from the saloon floor, keeping vigil together. An hour passed, then two. Sometime in the full light of morning, Billy's breathing evened out. The frantic heat under his skin seemed to lessen. Reno reached over and touched his forehead again. "The fever," he said, his voice rough with disbelief. "It's broken." He looked at Theda, and the gratitude in his storm-gray eyes was so profound it was like a physical touch. He didn't need to say the words. In that moment, he saw more than a woman who scrubbed floors. He saw a healer. He saw a strength the whole town had overlooked. And Theda knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her life was about to change. A week later, Reno sought her out. Not at the saloon, but on the street as she was leaving the general store. He stood before her, blocking the sun, his hat in his hands. It was a gesture of respect that made her feel dizzy. "Billy is sitting up and asking for steak," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "The doctor is calling it a miracle. I know better." Theda clutched her small parcel of flour and salt. "I only did what I knew how to do." "I need that at my ranch," he said, his gaze direct. "My cook is leaving. Her sister is having a baby back east. I need someone to manage the kitchen and the house. It's hard work. But it's not scrubbing floors." He paused. "The pay is fair. You'd have your own room. No one would bother you." It was more than a job offer. It was an escape. It was a hand reaching down to pull her out of the grime and into the clean air. Still, she hesitated. "Mr. Reno, you don't know anything about me. People in this town, they talk." "I don't listen to talk," he said flatly. "I watch what people do. I saw what you did." That was the heart of him, she realized. He was a man of actions, not words. He judged on evidence, not rumor. "Will you come?" Theda looked down the dusty street toward the Golden Spur, its doors like a gaping mouth waiting to swallow her back into the darkness. Then she looked back at him, at his steady eyes, and the quiet dignity in his posture. "Yes," she said, the word small but firm. "Yes, Mr. Reno, I will." Leaving the saloon was like shedding a skin. She left behind the bucket and brush, the smell of stale beer, and the heavy cloak of invisibility. The wagon ride out to the ranch was quiet. Reno drove, his large hands sure on the reins, the silence between them comfortable. The landscape opened up, the cramped, judgmental town giving way to rolling hills of golden grass and the distant, hazy blue of the mountains. It was a land of space and possibility, and for the first time in years, Theda felt her chest unclench. The ranch house was solid and unpretentious, built of timber and stone to withstand the wind and the seasons. It was a man's house, clean but lacking any softness. Her room was small and spare, with a simple bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the horse corral. It was the first room of her own she'd had since leaving home, the first door she could close and know she was safe behind it. The work was hard, as he had promised. She rose before the sun to start the coffee and the bread, and she was often the last one to bed after cleaning up the supper dishes. She cooked for a dozen hungry ranch hands, men who worked from dawn until dusk and ate like wolves. But it was a clean sort of tired. Her hands smelled of flour and onions, not lye soap and whiskey. The men were wary of her at first, the saloon girl in their midst. But her quiet efficiency and the quality of her biscuits soon won them over. She learned their names, their preferences, the small ways to make them feel cared for. Billy, his arm now healing cleanly in a sling, treated her with a devotion that bordered on worship. Reno remained a quiet, watchful presence. He ate his meals with his men at the long kitchen table, but he spoke little. Yet, Theda felt his eyes on her. She would look up from kneading dough and find him watching her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. He never complimented her cooking, but he always took a second helping of her stew. He never thanked her for mending his shirts, but he stopped wearing the ones with torn cuffs. His appreciation was in his actions, a language she was beginning to understand. One evening, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, she was sitting by the hearth, darning a hole in a wool blanket. The fire popped and hissed, a cozy sound in the vast silence of the prairie night. Reno came in from his office, a ledger in his hand. He didn't sit, but leaned against the stone mantelpiece, pretending to study the numbers. They sat that way for a long time, sharing the silence. "My wife," he said suddenly, his voice startlingly loud in the quiet room. "She planted roses by the porch. They all died after she was gone." Theda kept her eyes on her needle, her fingers stilling for a moment. She knew he was a widower, that his wife had died years ago. No one ever spoke of it. It was another one of the closed doors inside him. "Perhaps the soil is wrong for them," she said softly. "Some things need shelter from the wind." He looked at her then, a long, searching look. "Yes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I suppose they do." He closed the ledger and placed it on the mantel. He walked out of the room without another word, but he left the door to his heart open. Just a crack. A few days later, he found her behind the cookhouse, examining a patch of barren ground. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "This spot gets the morning sun but is sheltered from the north wind by the house," she said, crumbling the dark earth between her fingers. "It would be a good place for an herb garden, for the kitchen, and for other things?" He just nodded. The next morning, she woke to the sound of hammering. Reno was outside, in the spot she had indicated, building a low fence of split rails to protect the patch of ground. He didn't ask her what she wanted or how she wanted it done. He had listened, he had understood, and he had acted. He was building her a garden. Later that day, he returned from a trip to town with a small crate containing packets of seeds: rosemary, thyme, sage, and lavender. He set them on the kitchen table without a word. It was a gift more precious than jewels. It was the gift of being seen, of being heard. The real test came with the storm. It rolled in from the west without warning, a black wall of cloud that turned the day to dusk. The wind howled, and rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. A bolt of lightning struck a cottonwood tree near the barn, and the sound was a deafening crack that seemed to split the world in two. Inside the barn, the horses panicked. One, a young mare Reno was training, went wild with fear, kicking at the walls of her stall, her eyes rolling white. The hands were afraid to go near her. A horse in that state could kill a man with a single strike of its hooves. Reno stood at the stall door, his voice low and steady, trying to calm her, but the mare was beyond hearing. Theda watched from the barn doorway, her heart pounding with the rain and the horse's terror. She remembered her grandmother again, hanging bunches of dried lavender from the rafters of their own small barn. "It soothes a troubled spirit," she'd said, "animal or man." Theda ran back to the house, the wind tearing at her skirts. She went to her new crate of seeds and fumbled it open, her hands shaking. She found the packet of lavender and poured the tiny, fragrant seeds into her palm. It wasn't the dried flowers of her memory, but the scent was there, potent and calming. She ran back to the barn, cupping the seeds to protect them from the rain. "Let me try," she said to Reno, her voice nearly lost in the storm's fury. He looked at her, then at the frantic horse, then back at her. He saw the desperate certainty in her eyes and made a decision. He stepped aside. Theda approached the stall slowly, one hand outstretched, the lavender seeds in her palm. She didn't speak in words. She hummed, a low, tuneless melody from her childhood, a sound of pure comfort. The mare stopped kicking for a moment, her ears twitching. Theda kept humming, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached the stall door and held her hand out, letting the horse catch the scent. The mare snorted, her nostrils flaring, but she didn't strike. Theda kept humming, her voice a fragile thread of peace in the violent chaos. Slowly, tentatively, the mare lowered her head and lipped at the seeds in her palm. Her trembling began to subside. Rhino watched, mesmerized. Theda stood in the flickering lantern light, a small, quiet woman taming a storm, both inside the barn and out. He came to stand behind her, so close she could feel the warmth of his body. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture meant to steady her, but it felt like an anchor for his own soul. The touch was electric, a silent acknowledgement of the power she possessed. "How did you know to do that?" he asked, his voice low and full of wonder. Theda leaned back into his touch, just for a second, drawing strength from it. "Some things just need a gentle hand," she whispered, and she knew, as he knew, that they were no longer talking about the horse. The town of Redemption did not share Reno's admiration. Word had spread that the quiet, respectable rancher had hired the saloon girl from the Golden Spur. To the good women of the town, it was a scandal. They saw her in the general store and turned their backs, their whispers following her like biting flies. Leading the chorus of disapproval was Mrs. Gable, the town's self-appointed matriarch. She was a woman whose piety was as starched and rigid as her collars, and whose ambition for her own plain daughter, Eleanor, was boundless. Mrs. Gable had long considered Reno a perfect match for Eleanor. The union of the Gable property and Reno's vast ranch would create an empire. Theda's presence was more than an impropriety, it was an obstacle. Mrs. Gable's brother, Mr. Finch, the slick land agent who had tracked whiskey across Theda's clean floors, saw the situation as an opportunity. He was embroiled in a dispute with Reno over water rights to Willow Creek, the lifeblood of both their properties. If he could damage Reno's reputation, paint him as a man of poor judgment, it might sway the territorial council in his favor. The whispers grew louder, uglier. They twisted Theda's past, a past they knew nothing about, into a lurid tale of shame and disgrace. She was a grifter, they said, a woman of low morals who had trapped the grieving rancher with her wiles. They even turned her healing of Billy against her, murmuring of folk magic and witchcraft. Theda felt the weight of their judgment every time she rode into town for supplies. She held her head high, but their scorn was a constant, grinding pressure. Reno was aware of the talk. He said nothing, but a new hardness settled in his jaw. He became even more withdrawn, his silences deeper. Theda saw the worry etched around his eyes and knew she was the cause. The comfortable quiet they had begun to build between them grew tense, strained by the unspoken words of the town. She feared he was beginning to regret his decision, to believe he had made a mistake in bringing her to the ranch. The breaking point came on a Sunday. Theda had ridden to town for thread and found herself in the general store at the same time as Mrs. Gable and her circle of cronies. The women fell silent as she entered, their eyes cold and sharp as needles. Theda ignored them, making her purchase as quickly as possible. As she turned to leave, Mrs. Gable stepped into her path. "I am surprised to see you showing your face in respectable company," Mrs. Gable said, her voice carrying through the silent store. Theda's cheeks burned. "I'm just buying thread, Mrs. Gable." "You are buying far more than that," the woman snapped. "You are buying a good man's name and dragging it through the mud you are so accustomed to." The other women tittered. "Mr. Reno is a pillar of this community. He does not need a saloon floor scrubber tainting his reputation." "My work at the ranch is honest," Theda said, her voice tight. "Honest?" Mrs. Gable let out a laugh like cracking ice. "We all know what kind of work women like you do. You should be ashamed. If you had any decency, you would leave this town and stop poisoning it with your presence." Every eye in the store was on her. Theda felt stripped bare, the humiliation of physical blow. She saw the store owner looking at his shoes, the other customers suddenly fascinated by sacks of flour. No one would meet her gaze. No one would defend her. In their eyes, she was exactly what Mrs. Gable said she was. Without another word, she fled, dropping her parcel of thread on the floor. She rode back to the ranch with tears of shame and anger blurring her vision. She saw it all with painful clarity now. Her presence was a liability to Reno. As long as she was here, they would use her to hurt him, to undermine him in his fight with Finch. She had found a sanctuary, a place where she felt seen and valued. But she was destroying the man who had given it to her. The choice was clear, and it was devastating. She had to leave. That night, she waited until the house was dark and silent. She packed her few belongings into the same worn carpetbag she had arrived with. On the kitchen table, she left a note. It was short, the words smudged by a single tear that fell on the paper. "Thank you for your kindness," it read. "I cannot be the cause of your ruin. Do not look for me." She slipped out into the cool, moonless night. She didn't take a horse. She would not steal from him, not even to aid her own escape. She simply started walking, her face set toward the east, back toward the world that had cast her out. With every step, she felt the fragile hope she had nurtured over the past months crumbling into dust. The quiet rancher had seen her, yes, but the world had not. And the world, it seemed, had won. Reno found the note at dawn. He read it once, then twice, his face hardening into a familiar, impenetrable mask. The ranch hands saw him and kept their distance, recognizing the return of the cold, solitary man he had been before Theda's arrival. He crumpled the note in his fist, the hope that had begun to thaw the ice around his heart freezing solid once more. He went about his work with a grim, silent fury, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if he could will her back into existence. For a full day he let the silence and the emptiness of the house consume him. He told himself it was for the best. She was right. She was a danger to him, to his land, to the memory of the life he had once had. He retreated into his damage, letting the cold walls he had built around himself rise higher and stronger than ever before. The ranch felt hollow. The food tasted of ash. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was an accusation. Theda did not get far. By the second day, her feet were blistered and her hope was gone. She had been foolish to think she could ever belong anywhere. She was hiding in a thicket of willows by a creek, trying to sleep, when she heard the voices. Two men, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun. She recognized them as men who worked for Mr. Finch. They were standing near the head gate of the irrigation ditch that diverted water from Willow Creek onto Reno's land. "Finch wants it done before the council meeting this afternoon," one of them said. "Just jam the gate. Make it look like a log washed down in the last rain. By the time Reno figures it out, his north pasture will be bone dry, and the council will see he can't even manage his own water. Finch will get the rights for sure." The other man grumbled but picked up a heavy iron pry bar. Theta watched in horror as they forced a large waterlogged timber into the headgate mechanism, effectively blocking the flow of water to Reno's ranch. They stood back to admire their work, then mounted their horses and rode off, laughing. For a moment, Theta was paralyzed by fear. She should keep running. This was not her fight. Finch and his men were dangerous. Getting involved would only bring her more trouble. But then she thought of Reno. She thought of the garden he had built for her, the way he'd stood behind her in the barn, the quiet respect in his eyes. He had offered her a home, a chance. He had stood against the town's judgment for her. She could not run now. She could not let them do this to him. In that moment, her own safety ceased to matter. She turned and began to run, not away, but back. Back toward the ranch. Back toward the man she had tried to protect by leaving. The town hall was packed for the water rights hearing. It was the most important issue to face redemption in years. Mr. Finch was speaking, his voice smooth and reasonable as he outlined his case. He painted Reno as a man distracted, his judgment clouded, no longer capable of managing the vast resources of his ranch. "We need a steady hand to control the water," Finch said, looking pointedly at the town council. "Not a man whose head has been turned by unsuitable company." Reno stood alone, his face like stone. He was losing. He could feel it. The council members were avoiding his eyes. The whispers of the town had done their work, poisoning the well of his reputation. He had lost Theta, and now he was about to lose the lifeblood of his land. Just as the council chairman was about to call for a vote, the doors to the hall burst open. Theta stood there, her hair wild, her dress torn and covered in mud from her frantic run. She was breathing heavily, but her eyes were blazing. A collective gasp went through the room. "He's lying," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. She pointed a trembling finger at Finch. "He sabotaged the headgate, this morning. I saw his men do it. They're stealing Reno's water right now to make him look incompetent." Mrs. Gable shot to her feet. "Lies! This is the desperate slander of a disgraced woman. She has no proof." "I do have proof," Theta said, her voice growing stronger. She held up her hand. Clutched in it was a heavy, distinctive wrench, rusted in a peculiar pattern. "One of his men dropped this by the creek. I'm sure the blacksmith can identify his mark on it." The room erupted. Finch's face went pale. Reno stared at Theta, not at the wrench, but at her. She had come back. She had faced them all, risked everything for him. She had saved his ranch. Now, it was his turn to save her. He walked through the stunned crowd, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The people parted before him as if he were a force of nature. He didn't stop until he was standing in front of Theta. He ignored the mud, the torn dress, the shocked faces of the town council. He looked only at her. He reached out and took her dirty hand, the one not holding the wrench, and held it firmly in his own. He turned to face the room, his voice low but carrying to every corner. "This woman," he said, his storm-gray eyes sweeping over them, "has more honor and courage than anyone in this building. What she says is the truth." He looked directly at Finch, a look of cold promise in his eyes. Then his gaze softened as he turned back to Theta, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. In front of the entire town, in front of the woman who had tried to destroy her, and the man who had tried to ruin him, he made his choice. "She is not the cause of my ruin. She is the mistress of my ranch. And anyone who has a problem with that has a problem with me." It was not a shout, but a quiet, irreversible declaration. He had chosen her. Not in secret, not in defiance, but publicly, finally, and forever. The wall around his heart did not just crack, it fell. 6 months later, the autumn sun cast a long golden light across the valley. Theda stood on the porch of the ranch house, a light shawl around her shoulders. Her herb garden was flourishing, its scent of lavender and thyme perfuming the crisp air. The scandal in town had died down, replaced by a grudging respect. Finch, exposed and disgraced, had sold his land and left the territory. Mrs. Gable still sniffed with disapproval when she saw Theda, but her words no longer had any power. Theda belonged here. This was her home. The ranch hands treated her not just as the boss's wife, but as one of their own. She was the steady, gentle heart of the sprawling enterprise. She still tended to their hurts, both large and small, with her herbs and her quiet wisdom. She had found her place, not by scrubbing it clean, but by healing it. Reno came up the steps, his boots making a familiar, comforting sound on the wood. He had been out checking the herds in the high pasture. He came to stand beside her, slipping an arm around her waist and pulling her close. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sky bleed into shades of orange and purple. The quiet between them was no longer a sign of his distance, but a shared language of peace and understanding. He was no longer the closed, damaged man she had first met. He smiled more, his laughter a rare but beautiful sound, like water in a dry land. She had healed him, just as he had rescued her. "The stars will be out soon," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Yes," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "They will." She was no longer a ghost, a creature of the floor. She was a woman who had been seen, who was loved, who had found her shelter from the wind. The vast, wild frontier was no longer a place to survive. It was a place to live. And as the first star pricked the darkening sky, Theda knew, with a certainty that filled her heart to overflowing, that she was finally, truly home.